Tonight's lecturer is Neil Kane. I am extremely pleased to be able to introduce him. I'm not going to talk a lot, but I'll just tell you a little bit about how I got to know him. I was at the University of Illinois for 10 years working in entrepreneurship education, technology commercialization, and economic development. And I met Neil because he was working with his company, Illinois Partners, and then subsequently with Illinois Ventures, a semi-captive venture fund that is associated with the University of Illinois. And he was working with a number of companies that he's going to talk about tonight that Illinois Ventures was funding. So I had a class very like this, a lecture series, and I invited Neil to speak. And I've now heard Neil speak, I think, 3 or 4 times. So it's been great because I've gotten to see the trajectory of the companies with which he's been affiliated. But as you're going to see tonight, over the course of our discussions, I discovered that in addition to the connections with the University of Illinois, Neil also has an affiliation with the University of Notre Dame. So he'll talk about that. His topic tonight is startups, leadership, and transition, and he's drawing from his personal experience. But I thought this was a topic that would add a lot of value to the lecture series because it's something that most people don't know anything about. To the extent that people are aware of anything with respect to entrepreneurship, they tend to think of a company is started by a founder, they launch it, they grow it, they stay with it the entire time, they leave it when you can pry it from their cold, dead hands, et cetera, et cetera. But in point of fact, that's not typically the way it happens. You know, companies need different leadership skills at different stages of their growth and development. And so Neil's got a lot of experience with that, and he's going to talk about that tonight. So at this point, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Neil Kane. He did ask me, however, before he starts, to make sure you all ask him lots of questions. There will be time at the end for Q&A, but he's very happy to take questions in the middle. So please don't be shy about raising your hand and asking questions during the middle of his presentation if something occurs to you. Neil?
Thank you. I've got this mic on. Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? I just turned the mic on. I want to make sure that I'm audible. Yes, in the back row? Thank you. As Laura mentioned, even though this is a big room and I may not see you, please, if you have any questions as I'm talking, raise your hand for this type of presentation, or stand up for that matter, or just shout it out. It'll go much better and it'll be much more enjoyable for me if you ask questions. I also want to thank you for the opportunity to be here. I've been a serial entrepreneur and I've been working for myself in one fashion or another for the better part of about 20 years since I got my MBA at the University of Chicago. But talking about what I've done and talking about startup issues is something that I'm particularly passionate about. My goals for this talk are several things. Number one, I hope that I can teach you something. I hope that it's mildly entertaining. And I hope that you'll visit my blog when we're done, because like all entrepreneurs, I'm trying to drive traffic to my blog. I'll put up a URL for that at the end, and I talk a lot about startup issues and transition issues. It's relatively new, but I welcome feedback as well, and if things in the talk are useful to you, or things on the blog are good or bad, or there's other topics you want me to write about, please let me know either here or through the blog. Before I go on, I know this is a 1-credit class, but I'd just like to kind of see by a show of hands, how many of you have started a business or actually think that you're going to start a business? What have we got? Maybe a third of the people, and the rest of you are just here because it's an easy credit or you're fascinated by the topic? Well, anyway, if you have questions, feel free to jump in. So the first question is, how did I become an entrepreneur? I got to tell you that my background is in mechanical engineering. I got my degree from the University of Illinois, and I went to work for IBM, which was a company that was really at the top of the industry when I graduated from undergraduate, and I was very happy to go work for IBM. But at IBM, I switched from engineering into sales and ultimately started getting my MBA from the University of Chicago at night. I wound up going through the exchange program at the University of Chicago, and if you follow this, I wound up completing my degree, my MBA from the University of Chicago. I earned my final credits as an exchange student in Australia. And for the opportunity to go to Australia, and later I studied in Japan as well on the same trip, I had to resign from IBM. But at the time, they were going through a downsizing, and they were offering people, voluntary buyout packages. So I figured after 5 or 6 years at IBM and a pretty good track record there, followed by an MBA with some international experience, I was ready to do something else, and I figured, the world was going to be the path to my door because of that terrific track record and credentials that I had, because IBM in its day was kind of like what Apple is today, very sought after, highly selective company with a great career opportunity, especially for young people. But when I got back from Australia, Japan, and we're talking almost 20 years ago now, it was a really lousy job market. And maybe not quite as bad as it is today, but it nonetheless wasn't good. And what I discovered painfully was that the world was not beating a path to my door. That I did have a good track record at IBM, and if I wanted to go into similar positions with other companies in the computer industry doing the same sort of thing, which was selling, that was a familiar path to me, and I'm sure I could have gotten a job. But with an MBA and international experience, I kind of expected that I'd be able to do something else, or that I'd be able to get hired into another company at a higher position. And I found myself woefully disappointed at the likelihood of that in the job market at the time. Now, the backstory here, and there is a point to all of this, which I'll get to in just a moment, is everybody in my family is or has been an entrepreneur. And I'll tie this together in a moment, but first I want to tell you a story about my grandfather. My grandfather was a football player in Chicago at Marshall High School. I don't know if you can see that, but this, on the bottom it says Marshall High School 1927. So my grandfather was an all-city football star in Chicago. He graduated in 1928 and was recruited by Knute Rockne to come to Notre Dame. And as far as I know, he died in 1997, or 2007 rather, when he was 97 years old. And as far as I know, he probably was the last living person who ever actually played for Knute Rockne. And here's a picture, and those of you who are from South Bend, and today's the first time I've ever been to South Bend, by the way, despite the fact that my grandfather went to school here. That's my grandfather right there. I don't know who the rest of this crew is. I assume that's the stadium there, and maybe some of these other buildings are familiar to you. I don't know. But this was the legacy that I grew up with. And so my grandfather, unfortunately for everybody associated with Notre Dame, he was a sophomore when Rockne got killed. And he had come here on football scholarship, but according to the story that he told me, after Rockne got killed, the football program here basically kind of disbanded, at least for a couple of years anyway. And so he wound up leaving Notre Dame. So he never, played as a senior and got the kind of recognition that he might have, nor did he graduate. I think he finished college at some community college. But coming back to Chicago, he wound up opening a restaurant. And I'll tell you that story in a quick moment. I imagine a lot of Notre Dame people think this way, but my grandfather actually was buried with that football in his hands. And he was a rabid Notre Dame fan up until the end. So much so, this picture was taken just a couple months before he died a few years ago. That's Jack Rockne, Knute Rockne's son. And I haven't been able to figure out whether or not Jack Rockne's still alive, but I think my grandfather was here on homecoming a couple of years ago, and somebody at the public affairs office or the alumni organization managed to hook him up with Jack Rockne, and I know that that was really a highlight for him, and he died just a few months after this picture was taken. But there's a reason why I'm telling the story, which I'll get to in a moment, aside from the Notre Dame connection. But so my grandfather, after he finished college, and we're talking, 1933, 1934 era, pre-Depression, pre-World War, in the middle of the Depression, pre-World War II, he moved back to Chicago and opened a restaurant. And for those of you who saw this on my blog, some of this is on there, but you can see the restaurant opened in 1935. It was called Benny Kane's Barbecue. And the restaurant, in part, played up the fact that he was a locally famous football star because he was well known in the neighborhood on the west side of Chicago where he grew up with this kind of Notre Dame pedigree. And he ran this restaurant from 1935 to 1942 when he was recruited to participate in the war effort. He never actually fought in World War II, but he had to work in a defense factory, and so he shut the restaurant down in 1942. But when I was a kid, many of my grandfather's contemporaries, who would have been in their 60s or 70s at the time, constantly talked about how great this restaurant was and how great my grandfather's barbecue sauce was. And it was illuminating to me to notice that even in the announcement of the grand opening of the restaurant, his tagline here, "Our sauce is the best in town," was kind of what he was known for. So now let me go back to the story that I was telling. It's 1992, 93. I had just gotten back from Japan, where I completed my MBA, but I had resigned from IBM, and I was looking for a job. And what I noticed on the shelf in my parents' house, where I was now sleeping on their floor after I had come back from graduate school before I found my way again, were a couple of jars of my grandfather's barbecue sauce. And this picture was taken in the late 80s, but my uncle got the brilliant idea of taking my grandfather's barbecue sauce recipe and packaging it and selling it. Because again, as I said, growing up, all of us lived under this legacy of, my God, this is the greatest stuff I've ever tasted, you know, you guys ought to bottle it and sell it. So my uncle had this design made up, and he had bottled a couple of jars, largely made by hand at home. And I always asked my uncle why he never really got into business with this. Why wasn't he selling it more broadly? And his answers were always things like, well, I tried, but you know, I couldn't find anybody to make it, and they couldn't get the right ingredients, and just all of these kinds of answers that just did not completely make sense to me. I'm not saying that he was wrong, but it was just enough for me to say, I don't buy that. So I kid you not, I was literally sitting, you know, in a lounge chair one day, staring up at a bookcase where there was a shelf of this, a bottle of this on the shelf, excuse me, and I said, I'll bet I could do this. You know, the story that my uncle told just didn't make complete sense to me. And I thought, let me see if I can get behind this, because I was really eager to become an entrepreneur, to do my own thing. My vision was that I would start my own business, and as long as I got it to a point of self-sufficiency where I was able to make a comfortable living, that was good enough for me. Now, this was in the era before venture capital. I had no idea what I was doing. The entire amount of money that I spent launching the business was about $5,000 in total. The idea of getting investors was something that was completely foreign to me, and I had never started a business or anything remotely close to it before that. Now, granted, I had worked for IBM, I had my MBA. My grandparents, after they got out of the restaurant business, ultimately got into the retail camera business, so I grew up working inside the family business, which was a retail store. But the experience that I got actually running the business and doing it myself was infinitely more valuable than anything I learned in a lecture hall at the University of Chicago. And I encourage all of you, if you have a thought about starting a business, one of the closely held beliefs that I've developed with firsthand knowledge is you just got to go out there and do it. I mean, it's kind of like athletics. It's kind of like getting on stage and performing. It's kind of like singing in front of a group. If you let your fear or hesitation get the best of you, you'll never do it. You'll never know all the answers. The timing will never feel right. You'll always feel anxious. You just got to get out there and do that. And that's kind of the theme of my blog, too, by the way. It's called Belief Without Evidence, which is a euphemism for faith, which is a principle that all entrepreneurs need to have. So anyway, this is kind of the vision that I started with, and this is what I wound up with. And sure enough, I learned that there are ways in which you can mass-produce barbecue sauce. And so I just went on a quest to understand the industry and how you find people to manufacture it and how you incorporate and how you get labels made. And this was right at the time where these food labels became required law. I'm guessing every one of you in this room is too young to remember this, but there was a time when these were not found on every food product. So I had to figure out how to do that. I didn't know how to get a barcode. I didn't know how to get my product registered with UPC. I had to figure out all of that on my own. But it was a fascinating experience. And the thing that everybody told me about the food business before I started was, you'll never get it into stores. They said, you'll just never get it on the shelf. You got to pay slotting fees and allowances, and you know, Pepsi and Coke will crowd you out, and you won't be able to compete with Open Pit, and all of this kind of stuff. And again, I just kind of said, I don't believe that. That doesn't sound right to me, because if that were true, then there would only be a few major brands of products in grocery stores and nothing else. And if you go into, you know, at least some of the smaller chains and some of the specialty grocery stores, you see gazillions of these small kind of gourmet brands, and I knew there was no way that they were paying slotting fees and couponing fees and everything else. So I was determined, and my background is in sales, to persevere and prove those people wrong. And what I found simply is that getting into stores was one challenge that I was pretty good at, but what I didn't understand when I started the business was the challenge of getting out of the stores. And what I mean by that is merchandising the product so that people knew what it was and people were encouraged to buy it. And I can talk about this later if there's time, but as you can see, I also tried to position it not as a traditional barbecue sauce like Open Pit or Casey Masterpiece, but I called it a rich and tangy sauce. And we played up the whole Chicago nostalgia here. There's a little story about my grandfather playing for Knute Rockne, and all of this is true, and that's a photograph of my grandfather. Many people thought that this was kind of a made-up character, or that was some picture of Al Capone or something. But truly, it was all real. And one of the other lessons that I learned from this endeavor was that you don't always know exactly how your product is going to be received. When I started the business, I was thinking as though I was selling barbecue sauce, and my competition were going to be other barbecue sauces in the sauce aisle or the condiment aisle at a grocery store. It turns out, because this stuff was expensive, deliberately so, and I packaged it in a wide-mouth mason jar, so it didn't look like any other sauce as well, it didn't do real well as a grocery product competing with familiar brands that were a third of the price, but it did very well as a souvenir item. So you could get this at O'Hare, you could get this at the Sears Tower, at Water Tower Place in Chicago, all of the places that sold souvenirs and gift items about Chicago. I did really well in those places. And ultimately I got to the point where I recognized that to succeed in the business, I would have needed to extend the line and come out with other products like mustards or pasta sauces or what have you. And I was thinking of doing that, but decided to get into the software industry instead. And I'm going to move forward here, but I encourage you, again, to read my blog because there's an interesting story about something else that happened with this, and I'll come back to it later if there's time. But the first time that I went to my contract manufacturer and had them make the sauce to my recipe, they put in 10 times as much cayenne pepper as they were supposed to. So I was stuck with a pallet full of barbecue sauce that was way too spicy, and I'll let you read the story about how I wormed my way out of that from the blog, or we'll come back to it later. But I want to move on so I can get to the meat of the story here and what's relevant today. And remember, if you have any questions or whatever, just jump up, shout out, what have you. So where did I go from there? Okay, I mean, the beginning of my career, I worked for IBM, I got my MBA, I came back, I started the barbecue sauce business, and I wouldn't say it did poorly, it didn't do great, it just got to a point where it wasn't done. You know, I had made some progress, but I got to a plateau where I recognized that to do more, I would have needed to come up with more money, I would have needed to invest in more inventory, I would have needed to really make a long-term commitment to the business. And I kind of waffled on whether or not I really wanted to do that. And what happened from that point forward is a friend of mine approached me about doing a B2B exchange to service the food service industry. These are the companies that sell food to cafeterias and hospitals and schools and prisons and so forth. The other side of the food industry that's not grocery, but all restaurants and so forth. And so this was pre-internet, by the way, back in an era when if you were like the chef at a hotel or at a restaurant, every day you'd get a bunch of faxes that came over, which showed you what the day's prices were for poultry and protein and dry goods and what the cost of vegetables were for that day and so forth. And then all of the orders were placed over the phone, and it was a very inefficient process. And so unfortunately we didn't have the internet technologies to take advantage of, but our vision was the same, and we thought we could create an electronic trading network that would allow the buyers to be able to see and compare prices from multiple suppliers and then place orders online. So I did that for a little while, and we raised money from Heinz and Nabisco, and ultimately wound up merging that with another company. And then I became COO of a .com, and this was in 1996. which was before really the internet hysteria started, but everybody was getting excited about the internet, and there were very few people who actually had internet experience. The dot-com experience that I had wasn't the best, let me just say, but I got a call from Microsoft, who was fighting Netscape at the time in the browser wars. And Microsoft was very eager to bring people on board who knew something about internet technologies and something about sales, and I had worked for IBM. So everything came together, and after, like 5 years of doing different startups and what have you, I went to work for Microsoft, and for a while anyway, it was very exciting. I had the stability of a job and a regular salary, and there were resources and benefits and all of the big company perks that I liked that I didn't have when I worked in startups were available to me. But sure enough, after about 18 months, I got very restless and tired of working inside a large hierarchical organization. So I resigned from Microsoft voluntarily right at the peak of the dot-com boom in March of 2000 and went to work for another dot-com, which turned out to be a horrible experience, and I won't even go into it. But shortly thereafter, now we're in late 2000 now, so about 11 years ago, I linked up with a friend of mine who had this vision that here in the Midwest, and if you draw a circle with about a 250-mile radius of Chicago, you would include Madison, you would include the University of Minnesota, St. Paul, Michigan, Notre Dame, Purdue, University of Illinois. You capture all of those Big Ten schools, Notre Dame, et cetera, and you've got an extraordinary condensed density of research talent here in the Midwest, much more so than even exists in California in terms of the density and the number of researchers and the amount of federally funded research going on. You've got Argonne National Laboratory in Chicago included as well, Northwestern. However, and I assume many of you are aware of this, the region has a really crappy track record of turning those innovations into businesses that get grown here and ultimately employ people. And this was right after Netscape, which came out of the University of Illinois. So the technology was homegrown in Champaign, and then all of the employees, all of the wealth, all of the investment money that went into Netscape happened on the West Coast. And ultimately, Netscape was bought by AOL for $9 or $10 billion, and all the University of Illinois got out of that was a lawsuit. So there was a big push to sort of figure out how do we address that problem. And the fund that my partner and I started were meant to address that, and that is that we had this vision that we could do early stage investing in what we called complex technologies coming out of the major research institutions in the Midwest. So we were looking at things like nanotechnology, advanced materials, biotech, photonics, optics, basically anything other than software and pharmaceuticals. We saw there to be a real opportunity to do early stage investing and to work with professors or researchers or postdocs to commercialize that technology. And in one form or another, that's what I've been doing for the last 11 years. And I'm going to talk about that now. The original vision was that we were going to become a venture capital fund, but if you remember your history or you've read about it, the market started melting down in 2000, and then in late 2001, 9/11 happened, and the world went to hell for 6 months. And so we were not successful in getting our venture fund off the ground, but in that period of time, I basically indirectly and unexpectedly got a year's worth of market research under my belt, which was that I developed relationships with all of the licensing officers at all of the different universities in the Midwest and got to know many of the leading professors and so on. So we weren't able to get our fund off the ground, but that experience that I had set me up for the next thing, and all of this happened serendipitously. I wish I could claim that there was some grand plan, but I assure you there wasn't. But I was in the right place at the right time, and I bumped into the guy who runs the licensing office at the University of Chicago, which manages Argonne National Laboratory, by the way, on behalf of the Department of Energy. And he knew that I had worked for Microsoft, and he got me plugged into a project to evaluate a search engine which had been developed in the library system at the University of Chicago. And I took a look at it and wrote a report and gave him a presentation on my opinion of the search engine. And he said, "Thank you very much." And he called me a couple weeks later and he said, "What do you know about Diamond?" And And I said, well, I don't know a lot about diamond, but I'm a mechanical engineer and I learn quickly, you know, I'll figure it out. So I wound up getting hired to staff a grant that the University of Chicago got to open an entrepreneurship center at Argonne National Laboratory. So I was there for about 2 years, and then after that was recruited to become entrepreneur in residence at the University of Illinois in Champaign. Now, the rest of the story has a lot of overlapping stuff, because all of the companies that I started, some of them got started in parallel with when I was at Argonne and Champaign, et cetera. You'll never quite make sense of the chronology, but all of this has happened in the last 6 or 7 years. In 2002, was when I went to work at Argonne, and then in 2004, I moved down to Champaign. Now, in that period of time, these are the different startups that I've been a part of. Riverglass was a company that came out of NCSA, the National Center for Supercomputing Applications in Champaign, and they do data visualization. So I was involved in working with them. I was the founding CEO of a company called SolarBridge Technologies, which at the time we founded it was called Smart Spark Energy. And this was a power electronics company that had some battery and fuel cell and microinverter technology, and now they're based in Austin, focused on photovoltaics. I worked for Semprius, which was a printed electronics company. I was the CEO of a silicon nanoparticles company. And then finally, Advanced Diamond Technologies was the company that was based on technology that came out of Argonne National Laboratory. And I was actually a co-founder of that business, and in some ways it kind of preceded all of this other stuff. I have this slide here, though, just to show you the array of activities that I was involved in. And the definition of success for the people at the venture fund that I worked for was moving these companies along through the process of helping them raise money and build management teams. In none of these instances was I the guy who took the company public or sold it or what have you. But in almost every case, I was part of the founding team, and in some cases was the first CEO, and moved them along to a point where I kind of passed the baton to the next guy. It happened to be all guys, who had, you know, the industry expertise that was needed or the skills to take the company to the next level. And each situation was a little bit different. In the case of SolarBridge, we were zeroing in on getting into the power electronics business, and that was a field that I didn't have particularly much of a background in. In the case of Advanced Diamond Technologies, this was a synthetic diamond company, and I'll describe it more in a moment. And at the time that I came to the company, I had no particular background in diamond, but I do have a background in material science through my mechanical engineering degree. But I decided to stay with that company much longer than I did the other ones. So I took that company from nothing until a point in time when we had raised about $12 million cumulatively from private investors and about another 9 or 10 million from public sources, and I just left there about 6 months ago. So the rest of my talk is going to be geared around kind of how to start companies, what to look for, and how I transitioned out of those businesses. Any questions or comments before I go on? Okay. This is the homepage for Advanced Diamond Technologies. For those of you who are geeks or just fascinated by technology, I'd encourage you to check it out. The URL, I think I've got it on the last slide, I'm not positive, is www.thindiamond.com. I don't know if that shows up on here anywhere. THINDIAMOND.com. Of all of the things that I've done, this was the activity that I'm most closely associated with and the most concentrated effort. And to make a very long story short, and this is a topic for another talk, one which I gave in Laura's class at the University of Illinois, what we started with was a mechanism for being able to take greenhouse gas, in this case methane, the same kind of gas that heats your homes and that, you know, cows pollute the atmosphere with, and we turn methane into diamond. And we did that through a semiconductor process very similar to the way metals are deposited on top of semiconductor wafers. A lot of people assume that the way you make synthetic diamond is by taking carbon or graphite, like Superman did, and squish it under extreme pressures and high temperatures, synthetically reproducing the conditions at the center of the Earth. You can make diamond that way. That's known as high pressure, high temperature diamond, and a lot of synthetic diamond that's used for like sandpaper and abrasive is made that way. Ours was what was known as a thin film technology. It was a vapor process. We had a large vacuum chamber that looked like a big rice cooker. And under the right set of thermodynamic conditions, i.e. temperature, pressure, and inbound gases, which was methane as the source of the carbon, under the right set of conditions, the carbon atoms from methane rearrange into diamond. So we literally were turning greenhouse gases into diamond, and we would take about 50 cents worth of methane, bought at lab prices, and we'd turn it into about $500 worth of diamond. So how we did that, and the choices that we made, and the businesses that we got in, and how we characterized our markets, and how we raised money, is a fascinating story, but I'll have to save that for another time. But again, if anybody's interested, happy to answer questions now or after the presentation. But what I want to focus on is kind of the story of how the company got started and the different transitions that we went through. Literally, we started the company, it was me and 3 other scientists. So I already told you that I got the call from the people at the University of Chicago. And there were 3 scientists at Argonne National Laboratory. These are PhD, condensed matter physicists or material scientists or something like that. And they had developed this diamond synthesis technique that I described. And they were getting calls from Intel and Texas Instruments and Motorola and all of these big companies. And so the people at the University of Chicago said, we've got to figure out what to do with this technology. Do we license it? Do we start a business? What do we do with it? So initially, I was hired as a consultant simply to evaluate the technology and make a recommendation to them about an approach to commercialization. And one thing led to another, and just like the other story that I told you, none of this was preordained, none of it was scripted by me. It was sort of a series of serendipitous events, but I started out by studying the technology. Then they said, why don't you write us a business plan? And I did that. And then they said, well, why don't you go see if you can raise money? And I did that. And quite unexpectedly, before we had even started the business in a legal sense, we got a term sheet from a large strategic investor, a major corporation in the United States, who wanted to give us $2.5 million to get the company started. The problem was we had no company. What I had sold them on was a vision, and they liked me and they liked my co-founders, but none of the mechanics of having the company set up legally were in place at that point in time. And of the 3 scientists that I was working with, one of them really had kind of outlandish expectations, and that's the most charitable way I can describe it, in terms of what he should be entitled to in terms of his cut of the business. So with a lot of effort and a lot of uncertainty and a lot of pain, we had to take him out of the picture. So we actually wound up starting the company with me and 2 scientists, and the 3rd guy was now off to the side. And my 2 co-founders were both staff scientists at Argonne. We started the business. I was part-time living in Champaign. They were part-time at Argonne. And it was enough that we were able to get the company started. We hired one of the postdocs out of their program. He was our first employee. We got an SBIR. We raised some angel financing, and off we went. Until about a year or 2 later, I realized that even though we were making some progress, it was insufficient. And what I recognized was that I needed one of the scientists from Argonne to join the company on a full-time basis. And so I had to convince him to give up his tenured job and very stable government position on the fast track at Argonne and come join a startup. Now, this was a startup that he helped found, and it was based on his work, so he was obviously very familiar with it. But professionally, this was a very big decision for him to make. And it took a while for me to do it, but eventually I was successful, but I only hired one of the guys. The other co-founder needed to stay at Argonne, and even though he's a great guy and I continue to have a relationship with him to this day, he just didn't have the right kind of skills and the right personality to succeed in a startup, or at least that was my opinion. So now it was just me and the other scientist who became the chief technical officer of the company while our third co-founder, or second, the third co-founder, the second scientist, stayed at Argonne doing research. And then ultimately, and I'll tell you this story in a moment, I realized about 1.5 years ago that the company had grown to a point where it was an appropriate time for me to pass the baton to a new CEO. And I'll tell you that story about how we made that transition happen. And now, the only person of the original founding team who's still left in the company is the co-founder that I lured out of Argonne, who's now the chief technical officer. So you can see the progression about how the composition of the team and the founding team and even my role changed to a very significant degree over time. For those of you thinking of starting a business, there's a number of pieces of advice that I'd like to share with you. First of all, it can be unlikely. This depends, of course, on the nature of the business that you're starting. And if you're doing an iPhone app or a digital media or a social media kind of business, then this may not necessarily apply. But in the cases of a lot of the things that I've seen where we've started out with technologies that come out of research labs, it's often not clear at the time the company is founded exactly what business we're going to be in. And the synthetic diamond is a great example of that. Okay, the largest use of synthetic diamond in the world today is coating cutting tools like drill bits and stuff. Okay, and it's used a lot in abrasives, for example. But those are two industries that we chose not to go into because we had technology that allowed us to do things with diamond that you couldn't do with the traditional forms of synthetic diamond that are used for those applications. So we were making electrodes for water treatment. We coated the Jarvik heart, no joke, with diamond to make it biocompatible and to reduce blood clots, and we had a partnership with Dr. Jarvik. And so, you know, we went in that direction, and it would have been impossible for us to predict at the time we started the company exactly what we were going to do. So a lot of times when you're getting started, what you need is either a founder CEO who's the visionary, who knows how to sell the vision and get the company to a certain point in time, and then the business person needs to come in. Or in my case, I'm a generalist. I'm the business guy who knows or knew enough to deal with all of the mechanics of getting the company started, raising money, getting off the ground. But once it became clear exactly what business we were going to be in, it then became appropriate to go hire somebody who had spent their career in that industry. And that was one of the signals, not the only one, but one of the signals that sort of motivated me to kind of know when it was time to step out and go do something else. If you haven't yet started a business, I can assure you that it takes an enormous amount of energy and stamina and is very challenging to do under any circumstances and nearly impossible if you've got something else to do like another job or you're a student. But you really want to make sure that the founders are committed to the endeavor. It takes an awful lot of passion and entrepreneurial energy, and one of the things that I like about being part of an early team is you have to wear a lot of hats. Okay, so if you're a computer programmer or if you're a marketing person and that's the contribution that you bring to the founding team of the company, be prepared to have to do a lot of different things. In the case of our business, I mean, I wrote press releases, I did our budgeting. For the first couple of years, I ran the payroll, okay? I mean, I did a lot of different things, and that just comes with the territory, and that's also part of the contribution that I was able to make to a founding team, was somebody able to wear multiple hats. When you get to a point, and in our case it was several years later, where you've got recurring revenues and you're selling and your main objective is growth, okay, then you need people with different skills, and then you get to the point to where your team grows to where you can start to segment and segregate some of the tasks. And eventually we had an office manager, and then we had a bookkeeper, and then we had a CFO. And initially I did a lot of patent work, and then ultimately we outsourced that. So over time, you start shedding responsibilities, but initially be prepared to do a lot of stuff. If you're a whiner or a complainer or don't really understand what you're getting into, or you're a prima donna, you're not going to succeed in a startup. And definitely one of the filters that I looked for in choosing the founding team, and even some of the first 10 or 15 employees that we recruited, was to make sure that we had people who were really spirited, part of the team, and understood what they were getting into. And finally, it says there have a prenup. And I can tell you that this has applied for me in several cases, not just the businesses that I've told you, but even in my consulting business. There was a time when I had a business partner, and I got to give him credit for this, but he was astute enough to make sure that when we became business partners, we had a breakup agreement. You know, there was an agreement about what would happen if someday one of us wanted to step out of the business. How would that person sell the interest back to the other person? How would we value what that was worth? How would the money change hands, and so forth? And I really got to give him credit. He was a former investment banker, and so he had a lot of experience with this. I would have been more inclined to do it on a handshake. But what might have been a very painful experience for us became really a non-issue because we had agreed up front before any value was created and before we really had committed a lot to one another about how that was going to be done. When I left Advanced Diamond Technologies, it was a little less clear, okay? But I'll walk through that scenario in a moment. But the point is, if you're starting a business or thinking about doing it, there is a time and a place when you do need to spend money and get legal help, and this is one of the areas. You don't want to screw this up, or you're going to wind up losing friends or really regretting your actions or losing a lot of money or spending the rest of your life in court. So I can't stress enough the importance of making sure that you deal with this properly. One of the points of this talk is to talk about leadership. So let me tell you first of all that the CEO in the company has to be the person who buffers everything that's coming at the company. When there's bad news, you got to absorb it, and you got to figure out how to kind of regurgitate it back to the team. And I'm not talking about hiding the news from anybody, but presenting it in such a way so that you're honest and open with people, but they don't get completely demoralized and see the fear and the agony in your face. Because believe me, through all of these experiences of starting businesses and raising money and never being more than a couple of months from running out of money, and that persisted for 6 years, it's kind of like walking on a tightrope. And it does wear you down after a while, but if you let that fear show through, you're going to wind up finding it impossible to get people to work hard on your behalf. So the CEO has to be the buffer for that, both on the bad and on the good. Certainly when good things happen, you want to share that as well, but I never liked people to get so ecstatic as to believe that we were out of the woods or we were all going to become multimillionaires the next day, because that was never true either. So I sought to kind of buffer it so that I smoothed out the peaks and valleys and kind of kept everybody stable and rational. I will tell you too that while the job is very demanding physically, I basically assume that in this economy, every job is difficult. Okay, if you become a doctor, if you become a lawyer, I don't care if you become a salesperson, whatever job you take, if you're ambitious and you've got a degree from a good university, chances are you're going to be working hard. So hard work is not a deterrent at all for me, but what I didn't really understand until I was a CEO for several years is that the job requires a lot more emotional stamina than physical stamina. And that's something that you just have to live with to completely appreciate. But again, if you're starting businesses or you're first-time entrepreneurs, I strongly, strongly, strongly encourage you to find a mentor or a trusted advisor or a parent or somebody who you can go vent to, okay, because you will need to. And they say it's lonely at the top, and the reason for that is because the people that you want to go to when you're most upset or nervous or worried about what's going on in the company are the very people who are the stakeholders who are going to get even more worried than you are if you spill your guts to them. So I found myself unable, not always, because certainly a lot of this was shared, but sometimes you can't go to your colleagues, sometimes you can't go to your business partner, especially if the issues are about them. You can't always go to your board of directors because you'll spook them. So you got to find somebody in your camp who's going to be loyal to you, who doesn't have a stake in the business, who can talk you through that. It could be a spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever. Take my advice. Make sure you've got that person lined up before you go. there's a lot to be said for the nuts and bolts of the mechanics of building a business and how you incorporate and how you raise money and how you sell and how you find your market and blah, blah, blah. And that too is a topic for another time. But I really do think that it's important to have a vision. And I downplayed this when we started our company, but only now, since I've stepped out, do I realize the significance of that. There has to be a common way in which you rally everybody around a common cause and a purpose in the company, and your vision statement traditionally is the way in which you do that. And then finally, the thing that I've absolutely learned, and if I could do it all over again, this is the first thing that I would probably change, would be to be much more rigorous about setting up expectations and metrics and creating a management dashboard for keeping people in the company accountable to certain commitments, whether that was the number of patents that we wrote or the sales that we made or the number of employees that we hired, or even whether or not the phone was answered on 3 rings, or we responded to customers within 24 hours, or our checkbook was balanced promptly at the end of the month. All of these things were things that we were supposed to track, but I was a little bit too loosey-goosey about really enforcing that. And this is especially true, I think, with a lot of digital media and mobile social startups these days, you may not know at the beginning exactly what your business model is or what it is that you're actually trying to measure. And some people have said that a startup is nothing more than a collection of people in search of a business model. So the things that you will track and the way that you will instrument your business will change over time. But again, take my advice, let me just tell you that figuring out what matters in your business and how to measure it is really, really key. I haven't read the book yet, so I can't yet endorse it, but I just got it last week and I will read it and I'm expecting to like it. But there's a new book that just came out called The Lean Startup, written by Eric Ries. And I heard him talk in a lecture in Chicago last week, and he's really adamant about this too. And this was one of those things where, here's the guy who wrote the book, and he's sitting there talking about it, and I'm going, yep, oh, I learned that too. If only, somebody had given me this advice earlier. So again, take that as a pearl of wisdom, and if you're going to start your business, figure out what those things are that really matter to the success of your business, and keep track of them. The time came in our business, I'm talking about the last company that I ran, where, and this was about 1.5 years ago, almost 2 years ago now, we had a meeting with one of our largest customers, and what we were selling, again, were diamond components. We would take diamond, imagine, if you will, gold plating something. Everybody can, imagine, gold plating or silver plating on something. We did that same sort of thing with diamond. Okay, so we weren't making pieces of diamond or chunks of diamond or anything that looked remotely like, a wedding ring. What we were making was a thin film process where we essentially coated things with a film, if you will, of diamond. And one of the things that we did was we took mechanical components, typically made out of ceramic, that were found in rotating equipment, things like pumps and mixers in the industrial sector. And these were elements that wear out due to friction and abrasion, okay, and we coated them with diamond. Diamond's the world's hardest material, everybody knows that. Diamond, when it's smooth, is also a low friction material like Teflon, but it's much, much more durable than Teflon. So we would take these parts that were these mechanical components inside pumps and whatnot, coat them with diamond, and we would extend their reliability and lifetimes by 5 or 10 times. That was our business. And so I had this pivotal meeting with one of our major customers in December of 2009, where he said to me, okay, Neil, here's the good news. And I could tell by the way he set it up that there was a bad news coming too. But he said, the good news is we like your technology. We've tried it, we've tested it, we see its value, we understand it, we want to get behind it. And I was like, terrific. I mean, we had waited 5 years, basically, to hear that. But the but was, he said, however, we have a lot of concerns about whether or not your 15-person company with one location and a very thin balance sheet is going to be able to really step up to the plate and meet the needs of us. This was a global, multi-billion-dollar company. Really meet our needs if we decide to really turn on the spigot. And the gist of what he said was, we want to buy your technology now, but we're not sure whether we can do business with you as a company. And I walked out of that meeting, and I recognized the meeting for what it was because I knew eventually this day would come. And that was that all of the critical success factors for making the business successful going forward were different from everything that got us to that point up until then. Prior to that, it was all about proving the technology. Can we make it work? Does it have value? Can we bootstrap ourselves? Can we survive? Okay? Now I've got a big customer saying, I want to do business with you and I believe in your technology, but you guys have to become a real business. And so going forward from that moment, I saw the need for quality control and consistency and more staff and ERP systems and CRM and process control and all of this structure that rarely exists in a startup but always exists in big companies. We probably would have needed to put a disaster control plan in place, and what happens if the tornado blows off of our roof, and what happens if our computer servers get a virus, and any hiccup that we had could have multi-million-dollar ramifications for this big company, and they weren't about to let that happen. So anyway, that was the recognition that I had coming out of that meeting, and then I paused and asked myself whether or not I really wanted to be the person to climb that mountain. And what investors fear on this slide here is a CEO who doesn't know when it's time to go. Okay, trust me, I've been on the investing side too. Okay, what everybody worries about is that the CEO gets in over his head, isn't quite cut out for whatever they're supposed to do, and doesn't see that, and becomes belligerent or difficult or creates risks for the business if they need to be replaced. Replacing a CEO is one of the most difficult transitions that any startup will do, and it's the thing that investors worry about the most. I guess because I had been an investor and I understood that I wanted to assuage my investors' concerns that if and when that day came, I would put the interest of the business in front of my own interest, and that wouldn't be a concern. Whoops. And what I told my co-founders on the day we started the company was I said, when the day comes and it's clear that I'm not the best person to run this company, I'll step aside. You will have no issues with me. And there could have been multiple reasons for that, either because I wasn't up to the task, I didn't have the skills, we went into an industry that I didn't understand, who the hell knows? Whatever the reason was, I just wanted to preempt any concerns and let everybody know that I would be rational and well-behaved if and when that day came. And so after we had this meeting, with this major customer, I kind of paused and asked myself whether or not I was the best person to run the company from that point forward. Now the reality was I was burned out, and everybody on my board of directors saw that. After 5 years of raising money and never being really out of the woods financially, it was a very, very tough road. And that was after 2009, which was a couple months after the Lehman Brothers market meltdown happened and the housing crash, and it was just an absolutely difficult, atrocious year for every business worldwide. So we survived 2009, and I was proud of that, but believe me, it took its toll on me. So number one, I was burned out. Number two, remember I told you that we were at this inflection point and we were going from being a technology-focused startup and we needed to become a customer-focused business, and I paused and asked myself whether or not I really wanted to do that. My ego won't admit that I didn't think that I was capable of doing that because I've come out of large companies and I thought that I knew what needed to be done, but I knew that if I was going to be the person to do that, I would need to change the culture of the business, I would need to change my relationships with my co-founders, we would need to build a different team of people around me, we would probably need to change out some people on the board of directors, and I really wasn't sure that I was up for that challenge, and I knew as a large stakeholder in the business that the business would be better off bringing in somebody new who could deal with all of that stuff much more effectively than me. So I went to our board of directors and I said, it's time for a change. I didn't say that I needed to go and I didn't quit, but I said, if we don't make a change and get some of the skills of the people that we need going forward, now that we're entering this new phase, we're going to fail. And I said, and if you think that the best way to make that change is to get a new CEO, I'm totally fine with that. Because I was burnt out and ready for a new challenge, and as a stakeholder in the business, really didn't have a problem with that. And so they huddled and thought about it for a while, and they said, yeah, we agree. You know, you open the door, but we think it makes sense to get a new CEO. And that was the decision that was made. And I would just tell you that from the time that the decision was made until we actually had a new CEO, or I left the business, was a very, very difficult time. And I'll try to condense just a little bit of what I learned into the following bullets. First of all, we needed to raise money, okay? So in order to hire a new CEO, it was my belief, correctly I think, that we weren't going to be able to get a good credentialed CEO into the job unless the company had enough money in it to let that person do the job. Nobody was going to come into a company that was about to run out of money, and nobody, unless they had their own money, was going to take the job if they had to go raise money immediately. So after the decision was made that we were going to hire a new CEO, I was left with the task, much to my chagrin, of needing to go raise money. And raising money for a business is hard enough as it is. Try doing it when you're a lame duck CEO and you can't tell your investors who's going to be running the company that you're trying to get them to invest in. Whatever fun is, this was the opposite of that. And I'll tell you a little bit later what I think we should have done instead, because it really, I think, was not the way we should have handled the situation, and I'm being charitable when I characterize it that way. But so I had to go raise money as a lame duck CEO, and because the decision had already been made that I was going to be replaced, we were legally obligated to disclose that to our investors. There was no way, legally or morally, we could hide the fact that we were trying to raise money while at the same time searching for a new CEO. That had to be disclosed. Then, and this is a fascinating story, but I don't know if I have time for all the details, but it's just a great saga in what you have to go through to raise venture capital for a small business. But to make a very long story short, we signed a term sheet with a group of investors from Asia late in 2010. So a couple months after the decision was made that we were going to look for a new CEO and I had to raise money, we finally signed a term sheet with a group of investors from Asia, and everything was very exciting, and we negotiated the deal, and we got through due diligence, and we were supposed to close in 90 days, and 90 days came and went, and then it was 100 days and 110 days, and by about 120 days, I knew something was wrong, and ultimately that deal fell apart. And after spending 6 or 8 months on it, it fell apart at a time when we had maybe 4 or 5 months of cash left in the company. And we had identified a new CEO who was going to take my place as soon as we raised the money. And there's a lot more detail behind this, but I don't have time to go through it all. But to make a very long story short, almost at the last minute, fortunately we had a backup plan, and there was another group of investors that we were kind of nurturing. And this is all public information because it's on the website. But we wound up within 3 weeks of the first deal falling apart, getting another term sheet with a group of investors from Russia. And then that deal closed in July of this year. So I actually left in April at the time when we thought the deal with the Asian investors was going to happen. And my co-founder, the technologist, took over as acting CEO, believing that there would just be a few weeks until the money came in and then the new CEO was going to start. Didn't turn out that way because of the way this deal fell apart on us, but I was still on the board of directors at the time, and even though I was no longer the CEO, I helped arrange the new financing. We got it closed in July, the company's got money, there's a new CEO, everybody's happy, and I'm on to my next thing. So, as I say here, eventually everything got done, but believe me, it was not pretty, okay? As time goes by and the distance from the events sort of recedes into the past, the story will get glossed over, And in the end, everything happened the way it should. We raised the money, the company's going forward, there's a new leader, we got the outcome we wanted, but believe me, it was a fairly rocky path to get from here to there. What I would do differently if I could do it again is instead of announcing that we were replacing me as the CEO, what we should have done was hire somebody underneath me, a president or a chief operating officer, and then promoted that person when I left. And then that just would have made the whole transition much, much easier. It would have prevented a lot of the disclosure issues. It would have made it easier to raise money. It would have been cheaper because we had to hire a retained search firm to find the new CEO. A lot of issues there. Once the decision was made that I was leaving, I was in the odd situation in that I couldn't leave immediately. Okay, I was with the company for 9 months after the decision was made that I was being replaced. And believe me, that was not entirely pleasant either. It took longer than we expected, and it was nobody's fault. But now that I've got the benefit of that wisdom, if I were to do it again, and if any of you wind up in this situation, my advice is that you document in writing very carefully exactly what the transition plan is and what your expectations are, what you're willing to do, and what you're expecting from everybody else. In my case, part of the choppiness of the process was due to the fact that not everybody was on the same page about what was going to happen. So I would document a transition plan, and I would communicate those expectations very clearly to the other stakeholders, namely the board of directors and the rest of the management team. Because through this process, once it was decided that I was leaving, I had no real authority over anybody any longer. I was lame duck. People were looking to the new CEO and the members of the board of directors to have much more influence over decisions of the company and their careers than me. Everybody knew they weren't going to get a raise, and I wasn't going to do anything to, dramatically increase our burn rate while I was lame duck. So I became totally toothless, and it was a very unpleasant feeling. And again, if I could do it over again, although the transition worked out well in the end, the way in which we handled it, I think, should have been done a little bit differently. Finally, let me just point you to a couple of links here, and then I'll take whatever questions you may have. Illinois Partners is my website. Illinois Partners at the moment is just me, but it's a LLC that I created 10 or 11 years ago, and it's the vehicle through which I do my consulting and a whole bunch of things that I do. You can go on there to see what that's about. This is my blog. I really encourage you to check it out. If the topic is of interest to you, sign up for it, read the posts, comment on them, whatever. And if you're interested in the website that I showed you for Advanced Diamond Technologies to learn a little bit more about the company, there's the URL for that. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions. And somebody, good, excellent, thank you.
If you do it all over again, like the college review, like mechanical engineering, would you have done some business degree?
The question was, if I could do it over again, would I do mechanical engineering or a business degree? Correct? I would definitely stick with engineering. Okay? I was an engineer as an undergraduate because I really liked engineering. And I would have bet you any amount of money that today I'd still be an engineer. And had it worked out that way, I think I would have been happy. I really like engineering, and I'm biased because it's a great background for whatever you choose to do. Engineers sometimes go into law, they become patent attorneys, it sets you up well for a business career. So I liked the foundation that gave me, even though I could not have predicted that I'd be up here today. The only second thing I would say to engineering, which I just think is a very useful skill, is programming. Computer programming, when I was in school, was Fortran. And I did everything in my power to avoid it at all costs. I was required as an engineer to take one programming class, and I took it in summer school so that I could take it pass-fail so that I could absolutely minimize the pain. But a few years later, object-oriented programming and Windows and stuff kind of became in vogue, and that's why I went to work for Microsoft, because I really love that stuff. I just don't have a background in programming. So I think if you've got good programming skills, you're always employable. The same is probably true if you're an engineer. Other questions? Yeah, think of some.
You have a
The question is, I've raised money several times, what's the methodology and how do you get to the decision maker? I don't think there's a simple answer to that question, but part of the skill, if I may say that, is knowing how to present a business concept in a way where you tell a story that lets investors see how they're going to get a return on their money. Okay, so it's common, especially for first-time entrepreneurs, to go get money from friends and family or people who know you. Okay, people who are investing in you. Okay, and our first round was a lot of people like that. The venture capital firm that I was part of, they invested. There was an angel investor who I got to know in Chicago quite well, and thankfully he had the willingness to write the first check. Otherwise, we never would have gotten off the ground. But most of our early investors were just people who came from our network. People we knew, people who knew other investors. You just sort of have to work the network. But the best advice that I can give you is you have to know how to tell the story in a way that investors understand, and you have to have at least enough credibility that they trust you. So trust, I think, was a big selling factor. And in our case, we were making diamond from methane, and it was just a captivating vision. And it was difficult, and it still is difficult even today, to really describe a clear business plan. I mean, it's not like we were developing a cure for blindness where we knew exactly what we were doing and why we were doing it and who was going to use it and for what purpose. We had what's called a platform technology with a lot of applications, and those are kind of difficult things to raise money for. But when you're raising money, you're really selling yourself. I mean, you have to, people invest in the business, but they're investing in the CEO and the team and their belief that you know what you're doing, and you're going to be smart enough so that if things aren't going right, you're going to pivot or change or adjust or adapt or whatever. So it's a lot of that. And then to just further answer your question, there are people, there aren't a lot of them, but there are people who can help you raise money for a fee. And I absolutely do not recommend that you sign up with these people initially. But for us, what happened by the time we were raising our Series C round, so this was our third round of money, we were 3 or 4 years old as a company, I had basically exhausted my personal Rolodex. So we signed up with one of these firms, they got a commission off of the money that they helped us raise. I knew that I could raise money, but I needed to be exposed to other people who hadn't yet seen the deal. And that's what these guys brought to the table. They exposed us to a lot of other investors who were pre-screened by them, who they knew had an appetite to invest in businesses like ours. And the combination of us having already raised some money and them bringing a new pool of interested investors to the table, we wound up closing it very quickly. So there are people who can help you raise money, but at the end of the day, if you're the CEO or the founder of the company, it's your job. You got to be able to do it. Yeah, right here.
Yeah, I was just wondering, how do you determine, first of all, how much capital you need when you're starting up the company initially? And then once you figure that out, how much you actually pay yourself, that's kind of always key, as well as when you kind of move on through investors, what percentage of shares you guys keep as founders give VCs who give investors?
Right. Okay. That's a lot of questions. There's an hour lecture to answer all of those questions. But the question basically was, how much money do you raise? And the answer is that's a dependent variable which falls out of your business plan and what you need to do to get the business off the ground. Okay? If you're a nanotech company or a biotech company, you're probably going to need a lot more money than if you're writing an iPhone app. Okay? So the place to start is with a financial model for your business. You have to be able to predict or model or ascertain what you're going to do with the money and what you're going to spend it on. And if you need to hire 2 programmers, you can figure out what that's going to cost. If you need to build a clean room that's going to cost $5 million, you're going to need to know what that's going to cost. And there's no simple answer to the question, but then what you have to do is you have to look at all the money you need to raise, and if you're lucky enough, maybe you raise it in one chunk and then the business grows to profitability and you're great. Most of the time you need to raise money a couple of times, and then what you have to do is you have to sequence the money raising with the milestones of the business. So a simple example might be, if you were doing an iPhone app, maybe you raise enough money to get to the point to where you launch a beta, okay? So that your investors see that you've done it, you're making progress, and then you get a little bit of more money so that you can put some finishing touches on it and really promote the heck out of it, okay? And then you get to another phase where people go, oh, wow, he developed and shipped an iPhone app and it's going well, and now he's got an idea for a second product. We know that he's bankable. So your financial plan and your business plan go together, okay? So there's no pat answer to the question. It depends on what you're doing, and it starts with the financial model. And in terms of what you pay yourself, it depends. I mean, a lot of times nothing, right? But it kind of depends on where the money's coming from. If you're a programmer, for example, and you're able to bootstrap your business and it grows just from the fees that you're able to generate doing programming or web development or whatever, pay yourself whatever you want. I mean, it's again, there's no clear answer because you probably don't want to overpay yourself because you want to invest some money back in the business. But at the same time, you can't work for free indefinitely. And then if you raise money from external parties, they absolutely would expect you to be able to have a salary, okay? And I think I would just shoot for something that's sort of kind of in the middle of the range of what you think is appropriate for a job of that type for somebody with your skills. Investors would look very negatively upon you if you were trying to raise money from them to overpay yourself. But it's equally true that you shouldn't be underpaid and struggling to live. Nobody expects that either. So kind of zero in on the median for what's out there. And you can look on, there's a lot of websites like salary.com, which will kind of show you what appropriate salaries are. And then in terms of what you give up, there too, there's no simple answer. That's a really involved question, but it could be anywhere from 20 to 60% of the business in return for whatever that first slug of money is. So the game that you're playing is when you raise money, you want to raise enough so that you know that you can make progress with it and reach your milestones. But if you understand how the arithmetic works, you're selling stock to your investors at a low price, so you don't want to sell too much, right? So it's a very delicate balancing act, and if you're in that position, you'd want to find somebody as an advisor or a mentor who can help you through that. Other questions? I know I saw another hand somewhere. Yeah?
Did you go into this business or any of these businesses that are starting with an exit strategy? The idea we're going to get this going, we're going to sell a lot of money in town.
Great question. The question was whether we started this business or any others with an idea of the exit strategy in mind. And I would say that that's something that I learned. In other words, we didn't really start with that in mind. We sort of thought that the technology was so profound and the opportunities were so captivating that if we got the traction that we expected to have in one of our markets, we would not have trouble either selling the business or maybe even taking it public. So we were not ignorant of the need for an exit, but we never really focused on that. We just figured all options were on the table. I would tell you in hindsight, though, one of the things that I learned is that it's more appropriate if you're raising money from professional investors to start with the exit and work backwards. Because ultimately your investors need to get their money out of the company, right? So if you take money from people, okay, you have to be able to give them that money back in some time frame, say 5 to 10 years, okay? And the only way they're going to get their money back is if you sell your business or go public or have some sort of financial transaction, or you pay them a dividend or something. But if they just give you money and you put it into the business, and the business goes like this, then there's no way that you can take the money out and give that back to them. So taking money from investors does, it may be what you need to do to get the capital to grow your business, but it creates a risk too in the sense that you have an obligation to others. Other questions?
Okay, that's it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.